Andrew Warren, I want to welcome you to Why We Do What We Do, the interview series that's sponsored by Marcys Law for All. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Peter, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, before we get started, I wanted to just thank you so much for the work that you did to make Marcys Law a reality in the state of Florida. You've done an incredible job being an advocate, an outspoken advocate and proponent for victims' rights and having them elevated to constitutional status, not only during the campaign, but also in its implementation in Florida. So thank you before we even get started for all the work that you've done.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was a righteous endeavor. We're glad that we got it passed here to elevate victims' rights, as you said.
So today we do welcome the Florida State Attorney from the 13th Judicial Circuit in Florida, Andrew Warren. Andrew has had a legal career that has taken him all over the country, and in probably every legal position imaginable besides actually being being a judge. Could you tell us a little bit about your legal journey?
Absolutely. After I graduated law school, I had the opportunity to clerk for a federal judge. So I left the East Coast. I was born and raised in Florida, but I went to school on the East Coast. And I went out to California and I clerked for a federal judge in San Francisco, which was an incredible and rewarding experience. I worked at a large law firm, first in New York and then in Washington, D.C., practicing complex civil and criminal litigation. And I always wanted to be a prosecutor. So I had the opportunity to join the Justice Department to serve as a federal prosecutor. I cut my teeth prosecuting street crime in Washington, D.C. And then I spent the majority of my career with the Justice Department prosecuting complex financial fraud all over the country. And it was fantastic because it was exciting and challenging work, and actually had the privilege and honor of walking into courtrooms around the country and announcing Andrew Warren on behalf of the United States, which is, you still feel it years after you stop saying it. It meant a lot to be able to represent my country in that way.
Yes, it is. And it is one of the things that really reinforces the gravity of the job that you have when you stand up and say, Andrew Warren for the people, Andrew Warren for the state of Florida, Andrew Warren for the United States of America. It really reinforces the enormity of the task that you have, and the importance of the work that you do, which is one of the reasons why we named this series Why We Do What We Do, because each one of our guests has really had some kind of motivation or inspiration to get into the world of victims' rights. And being a state attorney, you every day, by virtue of your job representing the people, are involved in protecting victims and survivors. Can you tell us a little bit about how all of those jobs that you've had in the legal world gave you an idea to rebalance the judicial system as you've talked about it, because you saw that maybe there might be a little bit too much emphasis on punishment and not necessarily enough about thinking about the whole case and thinking about victims' rights?
That's right, Peter. Victims had become somewhat of a forgotten piece of our system. I had seen too often where victims were viewed as the person that a prosecutor needs to get in court to prove their case, rather than achieving justice for the victims. That is a legitimate goal of the system. And so I had the opportunity when I started prosecuting street crime, throughout my career prosecuting financial fraud, and now in the state attorney's office, I've sat with victims in the courtrooms. I've held their hands as they're going through some of the most difficult times of their lives. And to think that our system wasn't doing everything it could to stand up for victims at every step along the way. That's why we needed Marcys Law. And you put it so astutely. It's about rebalancing things in favor of victims, making sure that victims have a voice in what's going on and that they're not that forgotten piece of the system.
Yes, and you heard about Marcys Law through a former state senator from Gainesville, where you originally from. And Marcys Law, as you know, when you were introduced to it, started back in 1983. Marcy Nicholas, for whom the law is named, was murdered after being stalked by her ex-boyfriend. And just several days after her death, her brother, Dr. Henry Nicholas, now Dr. Henry Nicholas, and Marcy's mom were in a grocery store, and they were approached by the person who had killed Marcy. And they had no idea that the person who had killed their sister and daughter, respectively, was even out on bail. And from that moment forward, Dr. Nicholas became inspired to see if he could do something that would rebalance the system, like you've talked about, and put an emphasis on not forgetting victims and to give victims the meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights that they deserve. And that's how Marcys Law got started. And then you were introduced to it from that former state senator because he knew the way that you thought about the criminal justice system.
That's right. So I was generally familiar with Marcys Law, but not intimately familiar with it. And a former state senator, a former state attorney in Florida who I knew, who had heard me talk about rebalancing the focus of our criminal justice system. He'd heard me talk about the need for reform and how reform means making sure that we're not only punishing people, but also embracing rehabilitation and helping people transition back out of the system into our communities, and of course, supporting victims. So he knew that this was a goal of mine and what we were trying to achieve in Hillsborough. And he reached out and said, Andrew, I really want you to focus on Marcys Law. This is something that is maybe on the ballot in Florida, and I want you to look into it because I think it's something that you would support. And as I learned more and more about Marcys Law, I realized that it was something that we needed in the state of Florida, and I was happy to be an early supporter of it.
And you became fully immersed, and you were on television, and you did commercials, and you spoke in the community, and which I think was important because you've earned the trust of your community as a full partner with law enforcement. Can you give the viewers an idea of just how large of a jurisdiction you represent? When people talk about the 13th Judicial Circuit, I know it's Tampa, but how many people are in your office and how many people are in your county?
Well, in terms of me doing some of those commercials for Marcys Law, we can only blame the casting director for the poor choice. But I was happy to lend my voice in whatever way I could, in part because Hillsborough is such a big county here. It's one of the, I think, the fourth largest in the state of Florida. We have roughly 1.4 million people here. Peter, as you said, Tampa is the largest city. My office is 130 prosecutors, 300 total staff, and we see 60 to 70,000 cases a year come through our system. So we're really familiar with seeing victims at the low end of the criminal spectrum to the high end of the spectrum. And we've done a lot of work over the past few years to try to make victims feel more comfortable as they navigate a very foreign process to them. And that's why it was such a good fit as Marcys Law was coming into Florida with a chance to be on the ballot, to make sure we got it on the ballot, to show Floridians why it was needed. And we were really pleased to see it passed.
Yeah, and you've really created a culture within your office from the top, which is a real victim survivor centered culture. And you talked to me a little bit about how you want your advocates, your staff, and your attorneys in your office to appreciate, as you put it, what happens when the file is closed. Tell us what message you wanted to send to the people in your office when you talked about that.
Well, when I talk about criminal justice reform, we all by now are familiar with that phrase, and we know that it encompasses different policies and different practices. But I talk about reform as an idea, and it's the idea that we as prosecutors have to focus on the long-term impact of what we do every day in the system. How do we make our community safer in the long run? How do we prevent crime in the long run? How do we stand up for victims at every step in the process? So what I talk to my prosecutors about is they shouldn't look at each case that comes their way as a person to be prosecuted, but rather as a problem to be solved. And we solve those problems sometimes by locking people up for as long as we can, when those people are threats to our community who need to be neutralized. But there are often cases where that's not the right problem-solving approach, whether it's embracing treatment and rehabilitation for people who suffer from substance abuse or mental illness, whether it's reducing the criminalization of poverty. There are different problems that we're trying to solve. And one of the persistent problems that we have is how do we make sure that we're achieving justice for victims and what they want? How do we make sure that they have a voice in the process, that they're kept in the loop throughout the process so that it doesn't, what happened to Dr. Nichols doesn't happen again to anyone else. So that's part of the culture we've tried to create here, really making our prosecutors understand the mission of what they're doing, supporting victims, making our community safer, promoting justice and fairness in the system.
And when Marcys Law was passed in January 8th, 2019, it was enacted in the state of Florida, and you wasted no time in implementing it and making sure that you educated your office as well as the partners in law enforcement that you deal with. I know that you deal with, I think you said 3,000 deputy sheriffs in Hillsborough County, almost 1,000 police officers in the city of Tampa. And you wanted to make sure that people were educated on this. Can you tell us a little bit about the steps that you took as the state attorney when Marcys Law was enacted?
Sure. So within our office, we updated our victim notification procedures. We wanted to make sure that we were figuring out the best way to keep in contact with victims throughout the process. We changed the information that we were giving out to victims at the beginning of the criminal justice process, from the moment they stepped foot in our office. We worked with our law enforcement partners who are very victim-centered to make sure that they had all the information they needed, not just to comply with the letter of the law under Marcys Law, but to make sure that they were embracing the spirit of it to keep victims informed from the very first contact with law enforcement. We did some training with our partner agencies. There required some technological fixes we need to do internally, but this was all geared towards revamping what we had already been doing to try to keep victims informed throughout, to really step up our game a little bit to make sure that we were doing it consistently from the very beginning throughout the end of the process.
Well, you raise a very good point with respect to revamping what you've already been doing and the culture that you had already formed in the state attorney's office that you lead. When other prosecutors, whether it's your fellow prosecutors in the state of Florida or prosecutors around the country who are being introduced to the idea of Marcys Law, where it is going to be on the ballot in states to come, when other prosecutors ask you, is this the impact it had on your office? Is it something that you had to revolutionize what you did in your office, or just reaffirm what you'd already been doing as a prosecutor?
It was the latter. I mean, we had a victim-centered focus from the early days of my administration here. And this wasn't, we had to rebuild everything. It was just making sure that we were doing what we hoped to be doing consistently from the very beginning to the very end. So it was a matter of making sure that our prosecutors were trained in the law, that they understood how to communicate with victims, that we were simplifying the method of communication because, our assistant prosecutors can't just pick up the phone every step of the process. So we wanted to automate that notification procedure. So it was really tweaking some things that we were already doing. But this wasn't, it was a fair amount of work to get it done, but it was completely worth it. I mean, this was a way to spur and increase what we were doing. As I said, to step up our game, to make sure that we were going above and beyond to keep victims informed.
And you've really done an amazing job of when you talk about having your staff and your attorneys and your victim advocates appreciate what happens when they close the file. It's pretty well known that you've done an amazing job of not talking about those people within the file as if it's just a name on a file or a name on a case box, but there are stories behind those families. There are families that are affected. And you made a point before, which is this is probably the most significant thing that will ever happen in this family's life, in this person's life. And you've really instilled that in all of your state attorneys and all of your prosecutors, that when they pick up a file, that they treat that as the only case that they have at that time.
I mean, our attorneys are overworked and underpaid. Our felony attorneys can have several hundred cases open at a time, and our misdemeanor attorneys, can have between 500 and 600 cases at any point in time. but we really try to communicate with them and make them understand that even though they've seen, say a simple battery case, 100 times over the last year, for that victim, this may be the most traumatic thing the person's ever gone through. And they shouldn't be just pushing paper and going through the motions. And our ASAs don't do that to begin with. They're fantastic about really embracing that mission of what we're trying to do here. But it is important sometimes to slow things down, to remind our colleagues that these are real people's lives, and they get it. I mean, they're the ones who are dealing with the victims as they come into court. We have a talented group of victim advocates who help victims, some of whom are former victims themselves. We just have a tremendous team here, and it's made it that much easier to try to be a leader in how we support victims throughout the state and even throughout the country.
Well, you bring up an important word, which is team. And, the way that you run your office, it's clear that when someone comes into contact with the criminal justice system in your office, they're not just met with an attorney or a staff member who just picks up the phone. They're really met with a team, with a victim advocate and the lawyer. And because the reality is these cases take some time. And so you get to know these families for a very long time, and you really bond with them. And that's what the team approach has done in your office, I think.
That's our goal, and that's our hope, is to try to give closure to victims and their loved ones, again, through what's often the most difficult experience they've ever gone through. And we know that the criminal justice system can never truly give closure. It can't replace a life that's been taken. It can't even make somebody whole, whether it's from physical harm or economic loss. But we should make sure that we're treating victims with the respect and dignity that they deserve, making sure that they have a voice, explaining to the best of our ability how the process works. And when we're not able to achieve everything that a victim wants, to make sure they understand that we're fighting for them, even though we can't guarantee the outcome.
And your constituents are particularly well served by someone like you with the breadth of experience who has been on, as they say, both sides of the V in the criminal justice system. You know what it's like to prosecute a case. You know what it's like to represent a criminal defendant, and you've seen it from both sides. Another question that I have that's related to that is, when other prosecutors or other defense attorneys or other people who are asking you, either in Florida or other states, about Marcys Law, the question that comes up sometimes is, how can you elevate victims' rights to constitutional status without doing something to take away the constitutionally protected rights of a defendant?
Well, the answer is in your question, right? A defendant's rights are constitutionally guaranteed in Florida by our state constitution and, of course, by the United States Constitution. So nothing in Marcys Law takes away from a defendant's Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment rights. In fact, they're two separate tracks. We can make sure that we're protecting a defendant's constitutional rights while at the same time giving victims a voice, making sure that victims are aware of what's happening in the proceeding, giving them an option to speak to a judge and say, this is what I would like to see happen, making sure that they have a role in sentencing if we're able to secure a conviction, making sure that even going beyond Marcys Law, that our office continues to support victims and their families even after a case is closed, to give them support they need in terms of connections with the community, to just be here to lend an ear, to give them a hug when they're having a rough day. That's why we can do everything that we're doing under Marcys Law to support victims without in any way touching the constitutionally protected rights for defendants.
Yeah, and to bring it back to something that you had just said, when you said that you also try to tell your state attorneys, your assistant state attorneys, that each person is not just a case to be prosecuted, but really a problem to be solved. And that really struck me in light of what we're really seeing all around the country since the murder of George Floyd. It's impossible to ignore that when you're talking about the criminal justice system right now. And you have There have been protests, and there have been peaceful protests. There have been violent protests. There's been some incredibly meaningful, productive conversation that's gone along with that throughout the criminal justice world with leaders like you. But getting back to that, each person is not necessarily a person to be prosecuted, but a problem to be solved. You actually made the distinction between peaceful protesters and violent protesters, and you didn't deal with them all in a one-size-fits-all approach. Can you tell us how you dealt with that issue?
Well, we made a pretty clear distinction here after George Floyd's murder. We condemned the murder. It was difficult to watch, a tragedy that should never happen. And in the wake of the protests that followed, we wanted to send clear guidance to our community that there's a difference between protesting peacefully and forcefully and passionately, but peacefully, versus what has turned into some looting and rioting, where in Tampa we saw stores broken into and a couple were burned down and people attacking law enforcement and committing acts of vandalism. That's not peaceful protest. And so here we've made the decision that we're going to support peaceful protests. Prosecuting people for exercising their First Amendment right doesn't solve problems, it creates them. And it weakens the bonds between our community and law enforcement. So we fully support people's right to peacefully protest. But we're also not going to tolerate people taking advantage of the moment to commit crimes, to steal, to vandalize, to attack. And so that's the distinction that we've drawn. And we've seen in large part peaceful protests in our community, and where there have been pockets of destructive and violent behavior, we've worked with law enforcement to identify the perpetrators and to hold them accountable.
Yeah, and the way you've dealt with this across the board is a real tribute to your leadership, and really a tribute to the way that you've put an emphasis on partnerships with your fellow law enforcement, but also partnerships with the community. And with that, you've established and built a trust with your constituents that I think has gone a long way in how you've handled this and the success that you've had in handling it. So that's a real tribute to you and your office.
Thank you.
Now, you're also known as a pretty innovative prosecutor, and you and I talked about some of the different programs that you have set up in your office. And one of the things that I was very interested in seeing if you could share with people is the Conviction Review Unit, and how you've seen that impact victims that are looking for ultimate true closure in a case.
That's right. Well, I appreciate the compliment of being innovative. I like to find ideas in other jurisdictions that have worked really well, and then I won't call it stealing them, but copying them and trying to bring them back to Hillsborough County. And the Conviction Review Unit's one of those. Conviction Review Units are specialized units within a prosecutor's office that look at questionable convictions. Wrongful convictions are rare, but they do exist, and they're contrary to the very fiber of our system. They punish the innocent while allowing the actual perpetrator to go free. So we wanted to establish one of these units to make sure that we were doing everything we could to look to see if we've ever wrongfully convicted someone. And we have a process set up, and I won't get into the weeds of it, but the short of it is that someone makes a representation and submits a petition that they were wrongfully convicted, and we have a special attorney in our office who works with an investigator and staff to go and actually run down those allegations and to look back into the case to see, hey, was there an alibi that was missed, or was there forensic evidence that came in that led to the wrong person along those lines? And we've seen in cases here where, victims who have had to deal with a defendant who's been convicted, but, professing his innocence for 5, 10, 20 years, saying, I didn't do it. And if only, the prosecutors and police had gone and talked to, John would give my alibi, and John was never interviewed, something like that. We've had cases where, we've gone and talked to John, and we've looked into that alibi, and it doesn't hold water. And when we can go back to a victim, the victim's family, and say, we've looked at this and we had an independent, objective review, and there is no credibility to what the defendant is claiming in terms of being wrongfully convicted, it's very powerful. It helps to give that additional closure to victims and their families.
And at the same time, if there is a wrongful conviction, as tough as that is for a victim's family to go through it all again, it shows that you're doing your job for everyone, for the people, and it's really driven by facts and justice. And it gives some comfort, as tough as it is to live through a case more than one time, to a family knowing that if the wrong person is convicted, you'll get to that as well.
That's correct. I mean, we know, as I said, that wrongful convictions do exist, even though they're rare. And so we're yet to have a case here where we overturned a conviction because of factual innocence. We've had some where there were some procedural problems in the case that we ended up vacating the conviction. But to be able to go back to a victim or a victim's family and explain to them that we're trying to make sure that the person that is being punished and was caught is the actual perpetrator. We don't want victims and next of kin to live with this fake hope, this fake closure that the person that the system caught actually is the wrong person. And again, we know what happens, but part of the reason why we do this is not just to protect the innocent, not just to hold accountable the guilty, but to make sure that the families and victims who are affected by these crimes actually do get closure, and knowing that the person who's been convicted of the crimes was the person responsible.
So it reinforces the fact that even when the case file is closed, that the case is really still open in a victim's mind and in the survivor's family's mind. And the fact that
yeah, our pursuit of justice never ends. It doesn't end just because the case is over. It doesn't end because the file is closed. You know, for a prosecutor to turn his or her back on seeking justice is unacceptable. And so that's what we're always searching for here. Justice to hold the offender accountable, justice for the victims and their family.
And it underscores and recognizes the fact that you realize that even though a case may be over in a sense from the court system, it is never over for the victim and the victim's family and the survivors, because they do live with it every day. And your office and the way that you run your office recognizes that. And that's really quite a credit to you and your office. And the way that you prosecute a case and the way that you handle a case with equal parts prosecution and justice and compassion is the way that is really a way that a prosecutor should always conduct him or herself. Now, and I want to just end this because the work that you do is such a serious thing every single day. We should probably see if we can end this on a little bit of a lighter note, but something that is related to prosecution and your job. There was a high-profile transplant from the Boston area who moved to Tampa, who had a tough time figuring out how the laws worked in Tampa, that you've talked about compassion. You've spared this guy. Could you tell us who that is and the trouble that he's had with trying to figure out how the law works in Tampa?
Sure. So there's a little known football player who came from Boston down to Tampa. Some of you may have heard of him. His name is Tom Brady. Apparently he's one of the best quarterbacks ever. And he was going to be a great addition to the Bucs this year. And we laughed because in his first, few weeks down here, at a couple instances where he was caught in a public park that was locked and closed, and he was, throwing a football around. And he was walking into, on another occasion, he was walking into one of his assistant coach's houses for a meeting, and he just walked into the house next door by accident. And I think he caught the homeowner by surprise. So, we joked on social media that we wanted to make sure that Tom Brady understood breaking and entering and trespass, but we think he understands, and we really welcome him to Tampa. In his short time here, he's already been an asset to the community in terms of his charitable giving, and we can't wait to see him on the field to help the Bucs win a Super Bowl.
Yeah, well, we do think you're going to enjoy Tom Brady in Tampa Bay, and we're glad that you did show him your trademark compassion as you welcomed him to your community.
Thank you, and we appreciate, Peter, you and all your colleagues in New England allowing us to have them.
Oh, of course. So I want to thank you again, Andrew. We really appreciate all the work that you do on behalf of victims, all the work that you do on behalf of the people that you represent in Florida, and particularly all the work that you have continued to do to support Marcys Law and implement it in such a successful way, and being able to answer questions to all of the other prosecutors and your partners in law enforcement. Thank you so much, Andrew, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too.